Good morning, students. Yesterday we saw, or rather covered the topic beyond the four Varnas integration. We have seen till now that how more and more people were now being added to the national mainstream, and we've also found that their ways were quite diverse to the urban thinking that we had when we started with our Varna system, which was prescribed in Rig Veda. And if you remember that even our Indus Valley civilization, it was a very, very urban setup. It was not a rural civilization at all. And that is how, when we started expanding and we started bringing more and more people into the fold, it was very difficult to really accommodate all of them under these four varnas, because there was so much of diversity in India even at that point in time, that yes, we had to come up and devise the system of jatis. And yes, it was the jati system was good to and favorable to a lot of sections of that diverse population, but we are finding gradually that it was also unfavorable to a certain section of the population who were not accommodated very, very directly, like, say, for example, the Brahmins or the Kshatriyas. These Varna systems were very, very clear, and clear demarcation was there that yes, these would be those kind of people who would be people who would be known as Brahmins, and these would be the kind of people who would be the warrior class known as Kshatriyas. But then about the other sphere of life, and then the different kinds of people who got or rather became part of the mainstream, we could not have accommodated all of them into just Kshatriyas, into either Kshatriya or the Brahmins or the Vaishyas or the Shudras for that matter. And that is how we had to concoct, if I may use this term, the system of jatis. And then definitely things started getting very, very complicated for a great section of that Indian population. So today we, yeah, for example, if you look at the last paragraph here on top in this box, a tiger like husband, the last sentence, even yesterday I said, is very kind of very revealing. Some historians suggest that the term Rakshasa is used to describe people whose practices differed from those laid down in Brahminical texts. Now, students, you have to understand that if we say that Rig Veda, the four Varna system of Rig Veda and the secrets of Veda only with the gods and the mighty, almighty, but then you have to understand, does it mention who Rakshas would be in Rig Veda? They don't, right? But do they also, now here we are saying those who would not really conform to the practices laid down by the Brahmins would be known as Rakshasas. But then does Rigved say that those who would not conform to these pure practices should be rather termed as Rakshasas? No. This is all something which was done and contributed by us, right? Uh, Now, that is something. Today, we would start beyond the four varnas, subordination, and conflict. Now, we are today talking about the conflict that also emerged. Now, while the Brahmins considered some people as being outside the system, they also developed a sharper social divide by classifying certain social categories as untouchable. This rested on the notion that certain activities, especially those connected with the performance of rituals, were sacred were sacred and uh, and by extension pure. Those who consider themselves pure avoided talking, or rather taking food from those they designated as untouchable. In sharp contrast to the purity aspect, some activities were regarded as particularly polluting. These included handling corpses and dead animals. Those who performed such tasks, designated as chandals, were placed at the very bottom of the hierarchy. Their touch, and in certain cases, even seeing them, was regarded as polluting by those who claimed to be at the top of the social order. Students, there's one thing that you have to understand here. You have to use, and you can only understand this when you use your common sense. Students, today we have deaths where one by one people just go to the crematoriums or to the graveyards, right? Because we die one by one. And one, we do not die that even in this corona thing, we are, suddenly it is not happening that in one day 50,000 people are gone, dead because of corona. No, it is not happening that way. So you have to understand that in those years there would be immense numbers of wars and battles and disease and all of that, where people used to die in hundreds and thousands. Right, today something you have been able to curtail most of the diseases. You have very, very elaborate vaccination programs. Today you do not fight wars every time a prime minister changes, but in those years, every time a new king would come, he would like to assert his superiority. He would like to bring as many number of kings and kingdoms under his fold, and he would be perpetually interested in waging wars, and naturally hundreds and thousands would get killed. Now these days you do not have people getting killed at the drop of a hat. Now naturally disposal of those hundreds and thousands of dead bodies, naturally it there would be a huge number of people who would be involved in this whole enterprise and operation. And naturally that those people were kind of considered to be slightly different, and those were considered to be, as it is mentioned here, polluting, because a great segment and a great section of that population, because 3 or 4 or 10 or 15 people cannot dispose of the dead bodies of 5,000, 10,000 dead bodies, or like Kalinga War mentions, more than 80 to 90,000 people died. Now, can you imagine 10 or 20 or 20 or 30 people getting rid of 70, 80, 90,000 bodies? Impossible. So you had to had, and naturally all these activities created a different segment and a different section of a section within the population. And the Manusmriti laid down the duties of the Chandals. They had to live outside the village, use discarded utensils, and wear clothes of the dead and the ornaments of iron. They could not walk about in villages and cities at night. They had to dispose of the bodies of those who had no relatives and serve as executioners as well. Now, much later, the Chinese Buddhist monk Faxian, that is 5th century after Christ, wrote that untouchables had to sound a clapper in the streets so that people could avoid seeing them. Another Chinese pilgrim, Zhuangzang, observed that the executioners, that is in the 7th century AD, that executioners and scavengers were forced to live outside the city. By now, students, even today, who lives in right in the middle of the city? Now, who would be living around, say, if I have to talk about Dehradun, then right in the middle of, say, the commercial areas, where there are a lot of activity in the buzzes, Rajpur Road, and I don't know, some other areas around Gantagar. How many homes have you seen there? And the people who would be living in the Rajpur Road would be definitely, if not super rich, but definitely well off people, right? Then most of the areas which happen to be the areas buzzing with activity, it is usually the well off people live. The poor people would normally live in the fringes of the city. They cannot afford accommodation right in the middle of city, anywhere for that matter, any part of the world for that matter, and any age for that matter. Do you think right in the middle of the Rome, the poor would live? Then where would the senators go? Outside the city? Certainly not, right? So naturally, as they were being kind of pushed outside the mainstream, and I'm sure it is not just about the people who were disposing of the dead and who were only involved with the dead bodies, that they were being marginalized. Clearly not. The poor people also, engaged in menial jobs, but they could not afford to live right in the middle of the city. So naturally, they had to settle in the fringes of the city, outside the city, and gradually, they would be. not that they would be boycotted, but then they would gradually find themselves being gradually alienated from the thinkers and from the main middle class and the society, the warrior class, the ruling class. They would normally be alienated after one or two generations. They would just not be able to connect themselves with the people living in the city. So naturally, they gradually got categorized and branded, whether as Shudras or whether as untouchables or whether Chandal and everything. And now you keep hearing about the domes and the chamars and so many different segments of which today form a part of the depressed class or the scheduled caste or the scheduled tribes, those kind of people. Now who are these people? If you find out that they're almost all their ancestors were living outside the city, in the fringes of the city, and that is how gradually, and a great amount of these people come from that segment of the population which was historically poor. It is only over the last 50, 60 years after independence that now they have started seeing a slightly better quality of life. But then for thousands of years, they were always the marginalized ones, okay, which did not everything have to do with the Brahminical system, or just because the Vedas prescribed it, or anyone who was anti-Brahmin, or anyone who was not conforming to the Brahmin thinking of living would be a Chandal or an untouchable. No, clearly not. It had also a great deal to do with the living standard, the poverty levels. So that also really mattered, students, right? Now, it always does, even today, in spite of all the law books and the rule of law and the constitution and the courts and the higher courts and supreme courts. There are certain prejudices that you can't shrug off, whether in Indian society or in European or in American, whichever society you want to pick up as a test case. Now, by examining non-Brahminical texts which depict the lives of Chandals, historians have tried to find out whether Chandals accepted the life of degradation prescribed in the Shastras, and sometimes these depictions correspond with those in the Brahminical texts, but occasionally there are hints of different social realities. Students, you have to understand, one very important thing. Now, I'll tell you something very interesting. Now, it is always said that the Brahmins did this and the Brahmins did that, and Brahmins were the ones who were responsible for that marginalization. No, students, no. It was like Rig Veda said. I wish we were in class, and I wish I could have explained all this on the board. Unfortunately, I can't. So I'll just try and make some sense here. Students, you have to understand that even the rights, that is rights, okay. Just go up Hindi mein, we say puja path, right? Now, which is almost like a monopoly of the Brahmins, right? Now, but students, very interesting thing which I would like to tell you, that the Brahmins, that the Brahmins who are into the rights of the dead, okay, Brahmins whom you find with their dhoti and all that Brahmin dress and uniform in the crematoriums, jo shamshan ghat mein aap jate hain, and where you see those Brahmins who are there performing the last rites of the dead men and women and the dead bodies. Students, they are Brahmins, of course, but they are, even there is a segmentation there. Those Brahmins would not be invited by you, your family, or my family to conduct Satnarayan Katha in our homes or to conduct marriages. We would not invite those Brahmins because they are Brahmins, but because they are into an entirely different kind of work. So they are the Brahmins who are assigned only the jobs which are related to the last rites of human beings, the dead, and what happens to the dead, and those kinds of rites and pujas and sacrifices or whatever there is. We would not be inviting them for the normal puja part, and then when you have opening of when you buy a new house and you have a grih pravesh, you would not be inviting them. So all of that is not just about the chandals and that only the unprivileged, that it is very easy and a convenient, if I would say, way of trying to put one section of the population against the other, but it is not so. Thank you.